Welcome back to J-Face Games, everyone. Today we're talking about an alternative magic system. So for those that don't know about the current system is that we have or those not thinking about the current magic system, we have the 4 basic dice: controller, defender, striker, and leader. And then we have mystic, which is the 5th dice, okay? You can play the game with just these 4, no problem. But if you have that 5th one, it unlocks different powers. Meaning that we have this power sort of tech tree, and occasionally there's different magic powers that pop off of that tech tree. And if you have the right size die, you then get a magic. Well, that was the original idea. And it's still the current idea. But Shane, after I posted this video on borrowing from Quest again, Shane Winter, one of the active members in the community, was talking about a more flexible magic system, and it got me thinking about a game called Magicka. And if those who don't know what Magicka game is, in essence, it's this: you're a little wizard, and you have 8 buttons on your keyboard that all represent different elements. And depending on the order in which you hit those buttons will depend on what you then do. And it's this, wide array of different magic effects. Here are the 8 buttons, here are the 8 elements. And these, you create beams, you create shields, you cast it yourself. It's crazy. And when the game first came out, you had no idea what the combinations were. There were no lists of, if you do this, this happens. You were just figuring stuff out, and it was madness. A lot of fun. So that got me thinking about, what could an alternative magic system look like that uses some similar concepts to Magicka, and to Shane's point, making a more flexible one, which maybe means more of an RP magic system of sorts. And so that got me thinking about, what are the potential building blocks, right? So you have the elements, right, which could be a part of that building block, similar to what they did in Magicka. So let me pull over. So you have the potential elements, which would be water, lightning, life, arcane, shield. This is just taking directly from Magicka. Earth, cold, fire, and then you have water plus ice or water plus cold equals ice. You have water plus fire equals steam. Water plus arcane equals poison. Arcane plus life equals necrotic. Maybe that one's me. And then maybe something like earth and fire equals steel. Maybe you create steel. Maybe it'd be lava, but maybe you could create steel out of it. And then maybe lightning, instead of lightning, you have also air. Maybe it's lightning / air. So those could be some elements, right? So once again, we're talking about these are building blocks. So you now have elements as building blocks. We know that the domain / school, that might be something like, I think, just traditional D&D. I started coming up with some other ones, but a buddy of mine was like, you know what? The traditional schools in D&D are so iconic that it's easy for people to say, oh, I know what that means. Divination. So we'll start here. We might get away from it. Enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, transmutation, right? And 5th edition has some really nice descriptors for these in terms of what is it they do, right? Abjuration being sort of your protection, etc. Conjuration being your, I'm going to summon something, create objects. Teleport, which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize that teleportation was conjuration. Divination. Enchantment, sort of your mind control type stuff. Evocation, the classic. This is your fireballs and damage. All right. We're working through this. Illusion, necromancy, drain life, create undead, resurrection, and then transmutation. Okay, cool. Now what? Now the final building block I think is to think about is like effect, right? So let's close these down real quick, just so we have some nice room here. So the final one to think about is effect. This might be like, is it a projectile? Is it a beam? Is it a AoE, a PB AoE, a projectile AoE, a self-imbue, a weapon imbue, a shield for self, shield for area, like a wall, a target debuff, a target buff, right? So this is, you have some sort of effect you're trying to do, right? Okay, so these are your building blocks. We'll open them up. And so now the question is, well, what can we do with these building blocks? And I came up with, so far I have 3 different concepts, 3 different ideas or systems, right? One of them is that you, in essence, create a whole new system, right? If it were a system unto itself, what would that look like? I think that what you'd end up having is that one, you have your attribute dice, controller, defender, striker, leader, right? Not mystic, because it probably wouldn't, you probably don't need it in this sort of system. Then you have your dice based on elements, right? So maybe you have this might be too much, but maybe each one of these elements, these base elements here, you have a dice associated with them, right? Then the DC will be determined by the effect type and school you're trying to use. You could get proficiency maybe in schools, and that would help. School will give you pluses and minuses, potentially. And then you roll the dice pool and need to get above the DC on, I don't know, all dice? Right? So what are we potentially seeing here? Well, we're potentially seeing that, as an example, you are doing a fire beam or fire projectile, right? Maybe this is like flaming arrow, technically like a fire projectile. What would this mean? You would have, this would be 3 dice potentially, because it would be fire, projectile, and striker, right? So maybe up here the type isn't determines the DC. Maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't, right? So now you have those different things that you're trying to weave together. The DC is based on evocation magic. Any pluses would come from your evocation magic proficiency, and you can spread those pluses across dice, right? So then if it's like +3, you could do +1 for each of them. Like that's something you could do after the fact, after you've rolled. So then you could also try Fireball in this system. And a Fireball that maybe then roots people. What would this be? That would be fire, projectile, area of effect, striker, and controller dice, maybe? So that means it's 5 dice? Is this getting unwieldy? DC based on evocation or enchantment maybe, because you're trying to control someone. And so maybe whichever one is higher, whichever one is a harder DC than the base DC. So once again, we're just spitballing ideas. So in this concept, you have you dice pool gather, so you can create any magic effect you want. I want to create I want to summon a bear and then I want to make sure that I want to summon a bear who has a fire shield, and then that bear is going to charge at someone. And what ends up happening is that I could do that two ways. I could take 2 turns, and the first turn I could summon the bear, and the second turn I could give it a fire shield. Or I could try and do it both in one round, but now it costs more to do it because I'm straining myself, and or it costs more in the sense that I have more dice that I have to roll, and so who knows. The big question mark here is, do all the dice have to succeed at the DC? I have no idea. I'm not sure. That would be but it's an interesting thought at the moment, right? Like, what does this potentially look like? So far, interesting, right? What else did we come up with so far that I've been thinking about? Well, another one is, how do you work it into the current system? I don't know at the moment. So working into current system. Let's see. Oops. Oh, that's, I didn't know that. I really want it to feel like it's weaving. You're trying to weave together sources of power. How do you make it feel like that? How do you make this feel thematic, right? So maybe we are going to roll dice against the target number still, and it will be the lowest of your dice, right? So if the ability controls and does damage, you roll weaker dice of controller and striker. Okay, not bad. Don't want to roll more than one other dice. Maybe I don't want it to roll more than one other dice because I don't want a huge dice pool. I want it to be still efficient. We currently have the D20 available because we're using it for skills. So we don't have to just use the D4. Okay. Could lift from the cipher system? Maybe the number of elements you pull in will multiply the base DC by that number. Think about the cipher system, they do that, every level of difficulty is times 3. It's like a 3, 6, 9, or times 3. Maybe the number of effects you pull in will also add into this. So that means that you could get some pretty massive numbers, but that's the challenge, and then you're using effects. So in essence, that would be very much like the cipher system. The proficiency you have might affect this in some way. Okay. So example of this might be DC equals 3, doing fireball equals fire plus projectile plus AoE plus evocation. So now is DC 12 because it's 3 times. There's 4 of them times 3 because base DC is 3 in Cipher. So that's a 12. I got to roll D20 and get a 12. With the spark points also equals 4. So now this 4, how many of these matters? Because it's going to equal the spark points you burn and creates the DC maybe. But failing sucks. Whenever you miss and you fail, that sucks. So in this scenario, you're rolling so currently rolling control, let's say this one's striker dice and D20. D20 must be above 12. Striker dice must be above target number. Is that too much to think about? I don't know. Okay. And finally, I had one other idea. And this is, I'm going to work through this somewhat here. It's a little vague. But I want to think about resources woven from the ether, right? So there's two games I think about when I think about this. I spelled that wrong, but it's okay. One is Mage Knight. Awesome board game, crazy difficult and all over the place. And then Ashes Reborn. Both these games use dice as potential resources, right? Meaning that they roll dice, and whatever the faces are on those dice tells you what resources are available to you during that round. So maybe elements are on dice, right? And so now at the beginning of your turn, or actually technically in the turn, you'd re-roll these element dice, and it would tell you what elements are available to you, because maybe the universe or the cosmos is this just sort of like stuff. Or maybe it's, you know, there are elements on the dice, but then plus elements in the environment, right? If I have you in a cave with water in it, water is always available every round. But then you might be sparking these, you might be rolling these elements, and it might be that, you know, other elements become available because they're, you know, sort of in this ether. So that gives an idea of weaving somewhat, like but it also, I think it would spark more role playing, because you've now got this idea of, I'm only able to use the elements that are around me. But I like the idea of maybe abstracting this mechanic, where now you have, think about character sheet with lots of circles, maybe like a ring of circles that represent the elements in the center. And then around that ring, you could, or maybe it's even more mixed up than it has to be. You have the schools of magic, and they're not connected by lines, but it's like there's circles on your sheet that represent the elements, circles on your sheet that represents the schools of magic, maybe circles that, or maybe a skill tree on the side, or not a skill tree, but, you know, like proficiencies and for the effects that you can do. I don't know, we're spitballing. But I thought it would be really cool to, you roll these element dice, and everyone has their own element dice. You roll your element dice at the beginning or the end of your turn, so that gives you time to think, and you socket them into the spots where it shows elements. And then maybe part of leveling is you draw lines that connect elements to other elements, or it connects elements to different schools of magic. And maybe there's limitations, maybe there's balancing acts, whatever. And so now I envision your turn being, I roll these dice, I put them here on my character sheet. I know what elements are available to me on my turn, or coming up on my turn. And now I think of what schools of magic are even potentially touching it, or that I have benefits with. So now I can still think about whatever ability I want, but it's based on that. So that's sort of more this abstracted concept for elemental use. So, all right, guys, this was more of a workshop. I'm going to actually title it workshop so that you know coming in advance this is not a clean video. But let me know what you think about some of these. These are obviously still works in progress, but I'd be curious about which ones resonate with you guys and what ideas this sparks for you guys as well. So that maybe we stick with the magic system we already have. Maybe we dip into this a little bit for potential magic systems. I think the more we dip into this, the more magic becomes the overarching driving factor behind the RPG, though. Because I think that this will start to dominate potentially the game mechanics, which is not a bad thing, right? I think it's something to explore, because there is potential that you could abstract, where we have these effects, you could abstract everything here. Like you could make it so that this is melee as well. That this is melee combat becomes this abstracted as well, which is kind of pushing towards open legend, in the sense that they just had all these building blocks and you created your powers and you created everything yourself. But I don't think they did it as RP based, or I don't think they did it like this. But you could technically have in here, you know, I don't know, like one-hander. I don't know, not that specific, but in essence, like bladed weapon, you know, or two-handed weapon, or polearm. I don't know. Maybe you could. Maybe you could have some of these elements be in there so that now everyone just uses this sort of combat system for everything they do. Anyways, all right, guys. Let me know what you think. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. Sorry for the nasally, I'm a little sick. But this is a quick workshop video, and I'll talk to you soon.